You know, Carl, he asked me a week or so ago, he rang me and he said, I've heard about you, just wondering if you could help us out. We're doing a service and it's part of a series and we want to address issues around closing the gap. And so I started to talk to Carl about the work that I do and I suggested I come and share. It's not often I invite myself to preach somewhere, but because what Carl's and the church is trying to achieve, I told him the work that I do and why I think it's a really important step to have a white fella come and share first. Let me explain to you why. Because in being called to this work that I'm called in, I think that we've done a lot of learning as an organisation, and I've personally done a lot of learning. And I think it's important to share that learning to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made in the past with the goodwill that comes from wanting to do something. And I'd commend you as a church if you're wanting to work out how to be good neighbours and how to live out your faith in the community where God's planted you. It's a really good thing. And if part of that's addressing the issues around reconciliation and our relationship with Indigenous people in this country, then that's a wonderful thing. However, there's some issues that you need to be aware of before you go into what is an incredibly difficult area. I've never been involved in something quite so difficult, quite so complex, quite so emotional. And so if I can help you avoid some of those pitfalls, then I hope that'll be a gift. So I've called this message Close to Home, which actually ties in nicely with the whole idea of the good neighbour. It's a bit of a play on words, and hopefully you'll see why. But the proposition I want to put to you is that there's a wound in the spirit of this nation. It's a wound that goes back to first contact between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the colonisers. And it's continued ever since. And I believe strongly that it's a wound that God has called us to name and to address. When we first started, we named our organisation Concilia. See, reconciliation's a great word, but I'm not sure it's the best word in this instance. Because what I understand about reconciliation is where two parties were together, like a marriage, where something caused the breakdown and now they need to be reconciled again. But what I came to understand as I moved into this work is that there was never a relationship of equals in the first place. There was always dominant culture and the marginalised. And that's the way it's continued. So it's very difficult to reconcile something that was never together in the first place. So we called ourselves Concilia. And we said what needs to happen is the reconciling, the coming together as peers and as equals. And so we started off with that, and our main focus became on sharing our story and a resource in a project we called Australians Together. So our background was really about a conviction that God had given us that there's a wound and we need to address it. But like everyone else, we did the normal thing, and it's a good thing, but we decided we'd go and help. And so I had some funding, and I was like Santa Claus for a while. I got to go and give money to people to fulfill their God-given dreams, to Aboriginal people. You see, there was lots of money for housing and for health and for education. None of it was working, but there was lots of money for it. But there wasn't much to support Aboriginal Christian men and women who were trying to fulfill their leadership in their community. So I was able to go and give finances to that. But in a funny way, I was perpetuating what had been going on for 200 years. I'll come in with the money to help you do things, but could you be accountable to what I'm expecting? And if that doesn't work, we'll move on to the next person. That's that funding cycle which actually keeps the power in the non-Indigenous people in this instance. And so as we were doing this, I actually went back to my board and they said, well, what are you proposing? I said, I actually don't understand how we ever got to the situation in our country where we don't know what's happened in the past. We don't understand this wound. How that guy that I told you about earlier who thought he was getting into the booby prize of ministry was totally ignorant. So they said, well, what are you proposing? I said, money is not going to help. And they said, well, what's going to help? I said, I actually think it's about relationship, but before you can have a relationship, there needs to be understanding. So we focused on an education and awareness program. It was a 4-part DVD series that we took to small groups, and we started with the church. And what we said was, you need to understand before you engage, because the engaging, if it's not done right, does more damage than good. This is a hard sell. I've got to tell you, it was a really hard sell. Because we'd go to people like Pastor Timon, who's already probably overwhelmed with the amount of things this church is trying to do, and we'd try to explain another thing that was important. So really the question I want to answer tonight is this: why is this any different to any other social justice issue, and how is it relevant to me and to my church? Just look around. There is not a high percentage of Indigenous people in this church right now. And that's okay, it's just the demographic. But so why is it relevant? You see, there are a lot of very, very worthy social justice issues in the church, very important ones. And even as I heard you talk about things as a church you're doing, I can see some of the things you're doing. This is important to you, and it should be, because it's at the heart of God. Now, addressing issues of poverty and social justice and acts of violence against the powerless, it's not new in the church. There is no new revelation I'm going to bring tonight on this. If you look at the scriptures, you take your Bible and you read it carefully, you'll see it's full of imperatives to go and express your faith to those that have been hurt and damaged, the powerless, the marginalised. It's not new. In fact, Micah 6 verse 8, which I'm sure you'll all know as it comes up on the screen, it says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." These are the 8th century prophets in the scriptures, along with Isaiah and Amos and Hosea, who speak about the heart of God, and that you can't be worshippers unless you're actually taking into account what's important to God. Now, the church in general, this is just a bit of background before I really hit you right between the eyes, but the church in general, and I'm sure this church, and I don't know much about this church, but the church in general is heavily committed to helping those that are hurting, to living out our faith, to the poor, the marginalised, to act justly, to love mercy. Social justice is really at the heart of what we do. It was a dirty word 20 years ago in the church, but we came to realise that faith without works is just not right. So you have to have both. You can't proclaim the gospel and not care for those around you. So we've focused on that. It's core to the message of our faith. And sadly, there are just so many causes out there that require a response from us. Some churches work with refugees and make that a focus. Some with unreached people groups around the world. Some work in the sex slave trade, and others with marginalised communities. And some do it all. So why is this any different to any of those very, very important issues? Why look at reconciliation? Why look at closing the gap? And the common response, and because I can speak authoritatively on this because it was my response, is that the government gives so much money, they're handling it. There's no Aboriginal people in my area anyway. It happened so long ago. It's time to move on. There are so many important causes, and this one doesn't feel particularly compelling, relevant, or heart-catching. But I want to use a story, because when Jesus wanted to change lives, he used stories. I know you'll find this really hard to believe, but it was 1977 when I was in grade 6 at Mitcham Primary School. That was meant to be funny, because I'm really, Thank you, pay that one. And one day, at this very middle-class white school at Mitcham Primary School, we were doing our normal stuff, and along came, outside the classroom, a lady that we didn't recognise with a boy, very dark skin, Aboriginal boy, that none of us knew, and the principal. And they knocked on the door, interrupted the class and said, "Just letting you know, class, we've got a new student. He'll be joining the class. He's going to be here with us for a while. Make him feel welcome. Everyone give him a clap. And here's a seat." And the teacher was very nice. And this kid sat down and we're like, "Whoa, Who's he? What's he doing here? And at lunch, we had the buddy system. Someone was going to look after him, but he didn't want to be looked after. He was as angry as a cut snake. And he just went off, did his own thing. But within a day, the noise had got through the schoolyard that there was some stuff going on. He was punching people, getting into fights, being abusive, swearing. And so I had a little bit of a role of protector in the school. So I gathered a group of people and with students, and we went up to Dennis, and I explained to him that behaviour wasn't good. Well, it wasn't quite that calming, the way I explained it. And he hit me with two of the fastest punches you could ever imagine. I was completely shocked. And he was in trouble, sent to the principals, and I went home and I told my dad what had happened. And my dad said, next time that happens, you get that little, and he made some colourful language, and he said, you just hit him as hard as you can. You won't have that sort of stuff. And he was, all this racist stuff came out. So I got to school prepared for the big fight. And we got into a fight and I got killed. And it was only a few days later or a couple of weeks later that he left and never ever came back again. And that was it. That was my early experience of Aboriginal people. Violent, nasty, swearing, different. And that was it. Never thought about it again. And then I got saved at 18. And what had informed my understanding of Aboriginal people was that experience and everything I saw in the media and what I saw in the parklands as I went past groups of people. And so I'd been informed by media and by limited experience and no understanding, and that's what shaped me. That's why I think years later I thought I'd got the Booby Prize of Ministry. And so we're all shaped by those things. But a long story for another time is that God had other plans. And my awareness was awakened, those scales fell off my eyes. And once I'd started in this work and I did my research, 6 weeks in, I was angry as a cut snake too. How could I have grown up in this country and not known the story that's happened to people? How could I not know about this wound a couple of hundred years ago and how it contributes to what we have today? I was a preacher by this stage. I was a school principal in a Christian school system. And when I got to my bits on Aboriginal, teaching about Aboriginals to my students, which was in the curriculum, I pulled out the manila folder, grabbed a few worksheets, and we did dot painting for art. We did a bit of drama and a story about Captain Cook. I was reinforcing the ignorance over time, and the media was doing the rest of it. So I had my heart opened up. I was blown away by what I'd discovered. And I had a conviction that the church needs to be at the forefront of addressing this wound because the church was actually part of the wound in the first place. But the question was, how? How do you do that when there are so many important issues tugging at the hearts of everyone in the church? And I can tell you a bunch of statistics tonight that would blow your mind. The statistics of incarceration rates for young people. Do you know that there are less than 3% of Aboriginal people in this country that identify as Aboriginal, but over 50% in our youth correctional services? That's out of control. The suicide rates from 18 to 24-year-olds in this country are out of control for Aboriginal young people. So this idea of closing the gap is because the outcomes for Indigenous people in this country are so far behind the rest of the population. Even the United Nations goes, this is terrible, this is shocking, what are you doing? So as a country, we name it, we pour money into it and we go, scratch our heads and go, it's not working. So this holy discontent came into me that the answer's not about more money and more programs and more whatever. It's actually about a change that needs to take place in us before it ever takes place in the other. I think this is a biblical principle. But sometimes when you come from dominant culture, it's not a criticism, it's just the reality. You have blind spots to others, whether it's refugees or the Muslim community or any other community. We must take the time to understand before we engage. But I'm not talking about studying them. I'm talking about understanding me and my worldview and the way I approach things first. So the statistics are appalling, and I could chuck them on the screen, but they never touch hearts. So let's look at a video of a lady who's incredibly precious to me to see that statistics are always rooted in the stories of real people. This is Auntie Iris's story.
At Cherbourg, when you grew up at the age of 15, 16, the government organised you to work as domestic women. The payment in those days was £5, and to me that was a lot of money. But to my amazement, my first pay week was £2, not £5. And straight away I asked, where is the other £3? And they said, oh, that has to go back to the settlement, the reserve where you come from. And I could not do anything about that. They've been doing it for years. That's how they controlled you, yeah. It was a common thing. We just didn't have any rights whatsoever, really, living on those communities like that. They told us it was going into our banking account. When you turn 21, you're eligible to apply for what they call exemption. You only found that you only had a few dollars in the bank. Where did the money go? They said, oh, that's all gone back to the department. We argued and fought for our rights to try and get some of that money that was banked. Now, Anna Bligh wrote back to say the government will only allow you to have $3,000 from that money. Now, people have been working for years and years and years, and there was nothing more you could do about it, and that's it. And that's not only me, there's a whole hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous workers that went out to work and did that. I've seen so many of our folk just turn to drink, alcohol, but I'm thankful that I didn't go down that track, that the Lord saved me.
Auntie Iris is married to an amazing Aboriginal man, Uncle Graham Paulson. And Uncle Graham's grandfather was out fishing one day in a canoe with the guys from Vanuatu. And along came the slave traders and they pulled him literally out of the canoe and forced him to work on the sugar canes of Queensland. You may have heard of the term Kanakas. That's who the Kanakas were. And he escaped eventually and went and lived in the hills and intermarried with an Aboriginal woman. And then from that family, Uncle Graham was born and developed, and he's an amazing man. But his story is one of tragedy and injustice and loss. And he marries Auntie Iris. And she's got another story on our website about the day that the home was taken from them. But I'd never heard of stolen wages, heard of stolen generation, but I'd never heard of stolen wages. And then I read her story. And then I rang her and asked her if she'd do an interview on video. And you know what she did when I asked her? She burst into tears and started sobbing. She said, I can't do it. I said, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. She goes, it's the most painful thing. Her teenage years were taken from her. She was forced, because of her fair skin, to work in the homes of non-Indigenous people. There were hundreds and hundreds of women all over the country that did this for years. And instead of being paid, as you heard, they had their money taken off them, and when they were eligible to apply for it, it had gone. And I thought, this can't be true. But then I read in the paper only 5 years ago that the Queensland government said, we owe $500 million, or some staggering amount. But we can't pay it all, but what we'll do is we'll give you all $4,000 if you sign here and you never challenge it again. And if somebody in your family's died, if you've died, your family can't claim it. That's horrendous. And then I read about the Western Australian government having the same thing. I know her children. do you not think they're angry about how mum and dad have been treated over the years? And this is a piece of hidden history. That's a real, she's like a mum to me. And there's story after story after story just like that. There's a story of Auntie Ruth, whose mum was 19 and went to the police and said, I don't know what to do with my two girls. Is there anywhere we could go just for a bit of respite? And they said, sure, take her down to the mission. And they got put in the mission and separated straight away. That was it. And when she tells her story, it blows me away. You see, I've got a teenage daughter. And during her teenage years, I had the privilege of being able to make sure that she got her music lessons and sport and friends and private schooling and all of those things. And she got a job and saved up and went to a Bible college in Canada. And I just delighted in seeing this young woman grow. I can't imagine what it would have been like if I had no control over the children and I watched them suffer and no one listened. And then there's Uncle Ozzy. He's an amazing old guy from south coast of New South Wales. And he was in a hotel and I had the privilege of listening to a bunch of these Aboriginal leaders talking. And he just was reminiscing about the times when his dad would take the kids into town and would be met there by the policeman who said, don't forget there's a curfew for Aboriginal people. And if you're not out of this town, I'll come and get you. And they talked about their experiences of going to the theatre and not being able to go in until the movie had started in certain places and not being... I am blown away listening to this. This is my country. This is Australia. Or the elders, a couple of old ladies who were at Eden Hills recently for a reconciliation week, and they were at Colebrook Park, which is around the corner from the church where I used to go, and they talked about what their experiences as two young women who were taken off community, had never slept in a house before, and were put into a house and were scared stiff. And once they'd settled there, they were removed again to Colebrook Home. But they weren't allowed to go to school with the local children because they were white and these were Aboriginal, so they started their own school. But within a short space of time, they were taken to work into homes. And they stood there talking to a bunch of school kids, fighting emotion, but saying they'd forgiven. A lot of these kids had never heard these stories. And when I think of Dennis back in that primary school, I now know what happened with Dennis. Dennis would have been plucked out of his home because of some dysfunction that had taken place in the 70s. And they would have been shuffling him from home to home, trying to get him somewhere. And that 11-year-old boy would have been scared witless. And when he came to a school, no one prepared us. No one told us what to expect. There was no education and no awareness. And so that poor kid was fighting his way, because when you are under stress, you either fight or there's flight, and he couldn't fly anywhere. So he literally went to the corner of the schoolyard while the rest of us looked at him down our noses and told him to behave himself like us with no understanding. That breaks my heart. And I could go on and on and on, but telling you all these stories will just paralyse you if it doesn't lead to some response in us. Some sense that we can be part of a better future. We are not responsible for what took place over the last 200 years. We're not. I didn't steal anybody's land. I didn't take any kids. But we're part of a story that's our story in this country. And so we are part of the next chapter, whether we like it or not. And as God's people, will we take responsibility for what comes next? If that step that you take is only about learning more. So when you read the newspaper and you read stories of Adam Goods or Eddie Betts or whatever, you see the story behind the story. You see the history that's led to what we've got today. We know that this is the heart of God when people have been hurt and damaged and broken. And so how do we possibly get people to listen to this when there's so many great causes? Well, I knew that if I was trying to fight for the piece of the social justice pie, we were going to get nowhere. So I tried something different. I approached pastors like your pastor, and I said this. I said, I want to talk to you about an issue of worship, which kind of blew them a little bit. I said, because if we truly understand worship, and you've talked a bit about and sung a little bit about worship, Pastor Timon is your worship leader. Because Romans tells me that this is your spiritual act of worship, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices to all of you. The singing's one part of it. Whatever you do is a act of worship, and by virtue of the fact that this man is the shepherd of this flock, he's the worship leader. So I said to our worship leaders, I said, if you're going to be a worship leader, I wonder whether your worship is acceptable to God. Because if we look at this next passage, and going back to the 8th century prophets, they said this. The 8th century prophets were raised up by God to speak to God's people who had temples and worship and sacrifices and did all of those things. And this is what God wanted to say through his prophets. He said, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me the burnt offerings and the grain offerings, which is what God required, I'll not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I'll not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. So that's Amos. Let's go to the next one, which is Isaiah. Don't worry about reading all of that, but he's talking about fasting, saying, you think I'm really interested in your fasting if your hearts aren't right? If you're not living out your faith, you think I'm interested in that stuff? He says, verse 6, is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and so on and so forth. The 8th century prophets were raised up to say, religion stinks if it doesn't reflect my heart. And I'm not saying that about you at all. But what I'd say is it's really important that we take time to reflect on our practices. Does our proclamation match our practice? And so what we said in this next verse is, this verse says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, Jesus speaking, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. And that's the pathway I took with pastors. I said, our brothers and sisters have something against us in this country. Some things that have been damaged and not named and not addressed. So if we want our worship to be acceptable, then let's put our offerings down and go and make those relationships right. This is true of all relationships, by the way. But with Aboriginal people, there's something that you can't change. This is not a judgment, this is just truth, is that this piece of land here, where your church meets and gathers and we worship God tonight, is actually on land that was stolen from the original inhabitants, taken. And that's a source of great pain. And so God has raised our organisation up and he's spoken to my heart about naming those things. That this is where God's planted City Reach Church, on this land. And so while all the things that we can do around the world are important and with our local community, this is our story in Australia and that's why it's relevant. Do you know there isn't a single pastor that I've spoken to who hasn't resonated with that? And guess what the next question is? What can we do? And I'm trying to change that whole thing from the doing. And I can't tell people what to do. But it's actually to people being willing to listen to the voices of Indigenous people, to being able to learn about our shared history before we go to how we're going to live in this country. So we say, listen, learn, live. But don't jump to the live. I want to encourage you to start this journey, but start it slowly and start with listening and learning. And that's why I said to Carl, I'd love to come and share before you actually start engaging with Indigenous communities, because I've learned so much about some of the mistakes that can be made. Why is it relevant? Because we're Australians. It's part of our story historically and it's part of our future going forward. And I've got my 16-year-old son here, Luke, and I want him to grow up in a country where we honour and we value others who are different to us, where we actually take the time to listen and learn to stories and respect people and honour them. And if we're going to do that, the work starts first in us before it starts in anyone else. There's a scripture that says in Acts 1 verse 8, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you'll be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the outermost parts of the world." Here's what I've observed in life, and I've been part of this. We are very good at building Jerusalem up and jumping to the outermost parts of the world. But Judea and Samaria were tribal groups that had a checkered history, and it was tough and it was messy working with them. But that's what Jesus said. You're to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and to your neighbours, even the tough ones, and to the outermost parts of the world. We can't miss that. And God's planted you here in this area to be a witness. And He's planted you in this country to make a difference. And He's planted you in this world to be His hands and His feet. So when He says how to be a neighbour, He's not talking about just the person next door. You know this. I'm just reminding you. And what I've seen is positive disruption in the church. If I had more time, I'd tell you all these stories, but I want to show you another video of a pastor who's been positively disrupted because of this journey.
I remember initially when I heard words like invasion, there wasn't much empathy in my heart. I had sad feelings just because it was a bit of a mess, but very little understanding. So I went away for a few days with a couple of friends who had chosen to become much more informed about the history of our Indigenous people in Australia and what the last 200 years of history had done to our Indigenous people. And so they were introducing information to me. And I had a terrible feeling. I had a reasonable position of Christian leadership already. And I started to have this haunting feeling inside me. How did I get this far in my Christian journey and remain so ignorant about a primary justice issue in our nation? I've got some serious ground to cover on this front to catch up. I started to see the Indigenous people of Australia's current reality through a lens of 200 years of cultural decimation. I'm married, I have 4 young adult children. That conversation found its way back into my home. So I had an educational role back into my own home then. I chose to preach on it. I initially brought one message, then I chose to run it right across Crossway. So we then preached 4 messages. We started to try and position ourselves as people who are friendly towards our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so then we had a group of Indigenous young people who were travelling from one state to another. They came and stayed with us here at the church. I was part of an initiative of prayer and worship across our city called Church Unite. And so I was part of the conversation to see an honouring of our Indigenous peoples at Church Unite. That was all part of the process of trying to roll out what I was feeling, what I was understanding. It's like I've had something open up before me. I now have a pathway I can faithfully walk along. And I'm glad for the journey. I'm glad I took it. I'm better positioned.
Using Dale as an example of somebody who's been willing to not launch to action, but to listening and learning. Dale rang me one day and said, "I've got 4 mates. All of them are significant pastors of large churches, different denominations." And he said, "I reckon my mates need to come on this journey." So we took them on a trip, asked them to suspend their ideas, and they've now got people they call friends in the Indigenous community. They've stopped we're going to go fix things and we're going to send teams out and we're going to do all this, and they've started to look at themselves. You've no idea what a difference it makes. I was up at Cairns last week, 200 Indigenous leaders. They've heard about what's going on at Crossway and other places, and they've really touched. One lady just came up and thanked me 5 times. Just all she could say is thank you, because she was crying. And it wasn't thanking me. It was going, thank you for being part of getting people to listen to what's happened. Because nobody wants to live in the past. Everybody wants to build the future. But we have to understand the past if we're going to build a better future, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Dale's is one of many stories. I had another video, I'm not going to show it now just for time, but there are many stories that we're recording to tell the stories, this new chapter that can be, where the church can be part of it, where the community can be part of it, and we can be part of this better country. I want to say well done to you guys. for taking a positive step forward. To even have someone to come and share on this, that's a good step. And what's the call to action? I don't have money to raise. I don't have programs to run. I don't have any of that. I just feel like God's brought us along to sort of champion people along. Because if out of this all that comes is you perhaps read the newspaper differently or have a conversation at uni differently, that's a really good thing. Now, we've got a website with all sorts of stories, lots more of the other stories that you could see. And we're doing more and more to build great resources because we believe that's what's going to change people's lives, is new stories and a different way of doing things. And I'd love it if you could all sign up and find out more, not for our organisation, but for this country. If we can become those that advocate, it might be a small advocacy or it might be large. But to be able to understand and become aware of the shared story of this country and to be committed to being part of the next chapter, that's a godly pursuit. That's going to make the difference in this country. And if you take those principles of listen, learn and live, and you don't apply it to any Aboriginal person in this country, but you apply it to your marriage or to your neighbour or to the marginalised communities around you, the church is going to take its place front and centre, being the change agent that we're meant to be. That we don't live by judging others, we live by listening to others, by validating what they've gone through, not judging what they've gone through, and seeing where that would lead. Because relationship's the key to everything, not proclamation. That's important for us to understand what we believe, but that's got to translate into living out our faith as godly neighbours. So what's the call to action today? Because you've got to finish a sermon with a call to action. It's listen. It's be learners before you engage, before you work out how to live in this space. It's, if you want to find out more, sign up. And we'll tell you what's happening. We'll tell you more of these stories. The reason why you've got a white guy up here tonight is because I'm a cultural navigator. I want to help people like you navigate this space. And I work with a bunch of Indigenous people who are cultural navigators, and they're helping their mob navigate this space. And together, we're bringing our mobs together so we can be Australians together. And I desperately hope the church will be at the forefront of this and set an example for this country. And I want to thank you for having a conversation with you tonight about maybe what God wants to do through you, in you, through this church.